Gaza, Anatomy of a Conflict, a comprehensive guide to the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. Chapter 1, Ancient Roots, Modern Divisions, a brief history of the land. To truly understand the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we must journey far back in time, beyond the headlines of contemporary battles and political stalemates. The land that holds the Gaza Strip is not merely a modern flashpoint. It is a venerable tapestry woven from millennia of diverse civilizations, religions, and empires. Its soil remembers the footsteps of prophets, the echoes of biblical stories, and the legacy of countless rulers, each leaving an indelible mark that contributes to the profound and often conflicting claims of today. For much of known history, this fertile crescent of land, often referred to as Canaan or Palestine, has been a bridge between continents Africa, Asia, and Europe. This geographic position made it a coveted prize, a strategic corridor for trade and armies. The Philistines, from whom the name Palestine is thought to derive, were among its early inhabitants, establishing a pentapolis of cities, including Gaza, centuries before the Common Era. Jewish tradition traces its roots in the land back to Abraham, culminating in the ancient Israelite kingdoms that left a lasting religious and cultural heritage. Subsequent empires, from the Assyrians and Babylonians to the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, each added another layer to its rich, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith identity. It was the Romans who applied the name Palestina to the region after suppressing Jewish revolts, a term that would endure. During the Byzantine period, from the 4th to the 7th centuries, the region flourished as a Christian heartland, dotted with churches and monasteries, particularly along the coast and in the traditional Holy Land sites. Then came the dawn of Islam in the 7th century. The Arab conquest rapidly absorbed Palestine into the burgeoning Islamic Caliphate, ushering in a long period of Muslim rule. Jerusalem, already sacred to Jews and Christians, became the third holiest city in Islam, with the construction of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque establishing its profound significance as a site of the Prophet Muhammad's miraculous night journey. Over centuries, the region's population gradually became predominantly Arabized and Islamized, though significant Jewish and Christian communities continued to thrive, largely concentrated in urban centers like Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias, and scattered villages. Throughout this period, Gaza, with its strategic coastal location, prospered as a key trade hub, a stop on the ancient spice routes connecting Egypt to the Levant. For 4 centuries, between 1517 and 1917, the entire Levant, including historical Palestine, was part of the vast Ottoman Empire. This was a period of relative, though not absolute, stability. Under Ottoman rule, the region was administered as part of Greater Syria, with various districts and subdistricts. While there were local identities and allegiances, a distinct, unified Palestinian national identity in the modern sense was yet to fully crystallize. The vast majority of the population were Arabic-speaking Muslims, living alongside smaller, centuries-old communities of Arabic-speaking Christians and Hebrew or Ladino-speaking Jews. These communities coexisted under the Ottoman millet system, which granted religious groups a degree of semi-autonomy over their internal affairs. Life was largely agrarian and communal, and despite occasional tensions, episodes of widespread intercommunal violence were rare. Gaza, within this system, maintained its importance as an administrative center and a bustling market town, particularly known for its thriving olive and grain trades and its deep-sea fishing. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the gradual decline of the Ottoman Empire, coinciding with the rise of new, powerful ideologies, Zionism and Arab nationalism. Zionism, emerging primarily from Eastern and Central European Jewish communities, was a political movement advocating for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was a direct response to centuries of virulent anti-Semitism and devastating pogroms, particularly in Europe, culminating in the unfolding tragedy of the Holocaust. Its proponents envisioned a return to the biblical homeland, drawing on ancient Jewish ties to the land and a profound spiritual connection. From the 1880s onwards, waves of Jewish immigrants, known as Aliyah, began to arrive in Palestine, driven by fervent Zionist ideals. They purchased land, established new communities, kibbutzim and moshavim, and began to build institutions like the Hebrew University and the Haganah Self-Defense Organization. These efforts often encountered resistance from the existing Arab inhabitants who saw the land as their own. Simultaneously, Arab nationalism stirred across the Middle East. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, desires for self-determination and independent Arab states grew. For the existing Arab population of Palestine, who formed the overwhelming majority, their identity was deeply intertwined with the land they had inhabited for centuries. They increasingly viewed the burgeoning Zionist immigration and land acquisition as a colonial enterprise, a fundamental threat to their culture, their land, and their nascent sense of a distinct Palestinian national identity within the broader Arab awakening. Prominent Arab figures began to openly challenge the Zionist project, leading to early skirmishes and protests long before mass migration. The Great War, World War I, dramatically altered the regional landscape. The Ottoman Empire, allied with the Central Powers, was defeated. In the aftermath, the victorious Allied powers carved up much of the Middle East. A secret agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 between Britain and France, predetermined the division of Ottoman territories into respective spheres of influence, laying artificial borders that would continue to sow seeds of future conflict and instability throughout the region. Crucially, in November 1917, while the war still raged, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration. This short but momentous statement expressed the British government's favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, with the critical proviso that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This dual commitment was inherently contradictory from its inception. To Zionists, it was a long-awaited promise of a return to their ancestral homeland. To Arabs, it was a profound betrayal, a deal made by a foreign power over land they inhabited and considered rightfully their own. After the war, in 1922, the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, formally granted Britain a mandate over Palestine. The mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration into international law, officially tasking Britain with facilitating Jewish immigration and settlement while also safeguarding the rights of the indigenous population. This created an impossible situation. British authority oversaw accelerating Jewish immigration and land purchases, which continually inflamed Arab nationalist sentiments. Riots and clashes, often sparked by religious disputes over holy sites like the Western Wall in Jerusalem, became increasingly frequent and violent throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Notable incidents included the 1929 riots, which saw violence erupt in Hebron and Safed, and the widespread Arab Revolt of 1936–39, a sustained uprising against British rule and Zionist immigration. Britain, unable to reconcile the conflicting demands of two nascent national movements, repeatedly attempted to find solutions, including various partition plans, most notably the Peel Commission in 1937, which suggested a Jewish state, an Arab state, and a British-administered zone, and white papers restricting immigration. However, none succeeded in diffusing the escalating tensions. Gaza, during this mandate period, remained a vibrant Arab city and a strategic outpost. It continued its traditional economic activities of agriculture and sea trade, but it also became a focal point for growing Palestinian nationalism within the broader picture. Its population, overwhelmingly Arab and Muslim, like the rest of Palestine, was experiencing firsthand the shifting demographics and rising friction. As the British mandate drew to a close after World War II, exhausted by its obligations, and facing an increasingly unmanageable situation defined by escalating violence from both Arab and Jewish underground groups, the stage was set for a dramatic and violent confrontation that would irrevocably shape the future of this ancient land and its peoples. The legacy of these ancient roots, layered with modern political divisions, directly led to the catastrophic events of 1948, a defining moment that would create two distinct narratives, each deeply ingrained and painfully remembered. Chapter 2, The Birth of Two Narratives, 1948 and its Aftermath. The conclusion of the British Mandate in Palestine in 1948 did not bring peace. Instead, it ignited a conflict that would forever transform the region and etch itself onto the national consciousness of two peoples. The events of that pivotal year are remembered not as a unified history, but as two profoundly different, deeply felt, and fiercely guarded narratives. For Israelis, the War of Independence and the birth of their state. For Palestinians, al-Nakba, the catastrophe, and the beginning of a prolonged diaspora. Following World War II, exhausted by the costs of war and facing mounting violence from both Jewish and Arab militias in Palestine, Britain declared its intention to withdraw by May 1948. The dilemma of Palestine was handed to the newly formed United Nations. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, known as the Partition Plan. It proposed dividing Palestine into independent Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem designated as an international zone. The Jewish state, though comprising only about a third of the population at the time, was allocated roughly 55% of the land, including much of the fertile coastal plain and the Negev desert. The Arab state was to receive the remainder, primarily the hill country of the West Bank and Gaza. The reactions were starkly different. The Jewish agency, representing the Zionist leadership, accepted the plan, seeing it as international recognition of their right to self-determination and a crucial step towards statehood, especially after the horrors of the Holocaust heightened the urgent need for a Jewish haven. Arab leaders and the Palestinian Arabs unequivocally rejected it. They viewed the plan as unjust, an illegal appropriation of their homeland against the will of the indigenous majority, ignoring their right to self-determination and handing over significant Arab-owned lands to a minority. Even before the official British withdrawal, violence escalated into civil war. Jewish and Arab militias clashed fiercely as both sides positioned themselves ahead of the imminent vacuum. Roads were cut, blockades were imposed, and villages were attacked. When Britain officially ended its mandate at midnight on May 14, 1948, the Jewish leadership, led by David Ben-Gurion, immediately declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Within hours, armies from neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded the former mandatory territory, purportedly to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state and to protect Palestinian Arabs. This marked the beginning of the conventional phase of what is now known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. This war, fought across less than a year, but with significant ebbs and flows and several truces, saw the fledgling Israeli Defense Forces, despite being initially outnumbered and outgunned, ultimately prevail. Through a combination of strategic brilliance, determination, and arms shipments, Israel not only repelled the Arab armies, but significantly expanded its territory beyond the original UN partition plan. By the time fighting ceased, Israel controlled approximately 78% of mandatory Palestine. For Israelis, 1948 is celebrated as the War of Independence, Milhemet Hatzmat. It is a story of national rebirth, a miraculous victory against overwhelming odds, and the successful culmination of the Zionist dream. In this narrative, the entry of Arab armies constituted an existential threat against a vulnerable new state, and the war was fought to ensure its very survival. The creation of Israel is framed as a triumph of self-determination, a return to an ancient homeland after millennia of exile. For Palestinians, however, 1948 is known as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. This term refers to the mass displacement and dispossession of approximately 700,000 to 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees, fleeing or being expelled from their homes in the territory that became Israel. Villages were depopulated, many were systematically destroyed to prevent return, and Palestinian society was shattered. The mechanisms of displacement were varied. Some fled from direct fighting, fear of massacres, like Deir Yassin, which, regardless of its exact nature, spread terror, or under explicit orders of expulsion, as documented in places like Lydda and Ramel. Others left expecting a quick return after the fighting subsided, only to find their homes inaccessible or destroyed. This narrative highlights the profound loss of land, property, cultural heritage, and the systematic denial of their right to return, which remains a central grievance. By 1949, a series of armistice agreements were signed between Israel and its neighbors, establishing de facto borders, the Green Line, which would broadly remain until 1967. These lines were explicitly stated to be temporary ceasefire demarcations, not recognized international boundaries. The territories outside of Israeli control were the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which came under Jordanian annexation, and the Gaza Strip, which fell under Egyptian military administration. The Gaza Strip, a small, narrow coastal plain, became an accidental holding pen for hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, many having fled from nearby southern towns and villages now within Israeli territory, such as Ashkelon, Majdal, modern-day Ashkelon, and Beersheba. Before 1948, Gaza City had a population of around 40,000. By 1949, the Strip's population had swelled to over 200,000, creating an unprecedented density. These refugees were housed in hastily erected camps, often consisting of tents and temporary shelters. Their plight captured international attention, leading to the creation of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East (UNRWA) in December 1949, specifically tasked with providing humanitarian aid, food, health, and education to these displaced populations. UNRWA's role immediately became, and remains, critical to the survival of Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere. The legacy of 1948 is therefore deeply divisive and profoundly formative. For Israelis, it is the year of their nation's triumphant birth and hard-won survival. For Palestinians, it is the year of their dispossession, their scattering, and the beginning of their ongoing struggle for return and self-determination. These two fundamentally opposed interpretations of history, each backed by compelling evidence and deeply held experiences, form the bedrock of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Understanding both narratives, not as competing truths, but as lived realities that shaped and continue to shape the identities, politics, and historical consciousness of both peoples, is essential to grasping the emotional depth and enduring intractability of this perennial struggle. The seed of continuous conflict was sown in the very different ways 1948 was experienced and remembered. Chapter 3, Under Occupation: The Rise of Palestinian Resistance and the West Bank Story. The period between the 1948 war and the seismic events of 1967 saw two contrasting realities unfold in the land of historical Palestine. For Israel, these were years of intense nation-building. The fledgling state absorbed hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants, developed its economy, built a formidable military, and established its democratic institutions. It was a period of consolidation and growth, albeit within a hostile neighborhood marked by frequent border skirmishes and an unresolved conflict with its Arab neighbors. For Palestinians, however, these 2 decades were defined by dispersal and the genesis of organized resistance. The millions who remained within the newly formed State of Israel became Israeli citizens, though often as a marginalized minority. The rest found themselves as refugees in surrounding Arab countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, or confined to the West Bank under Jordanian rule and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian military administration. Life in the sprawling refugee camps, marked by poverty and despair, fostered a deep sense of injustice and a burning desire for return. This collective trauma became the engine for a new form of Palestinian nationalism, one focused on self-liberation and determined to reclaim what was lost. From this environment emerged the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, in 1964. Created by the Arab League, the PLO initially aimed to represent the Palestinian people and liberate Palestine through armed struggle. It quickly became the umbrella movement for various factions, the most prominent being Fatah, led by the charismatic Yasser Arafat, which championed armed struggle and established an independent Palestinian identity distinct from the control of Arab regimes. Palestinian Fedayeen, or commandos, operating from neighboring states, launched cross-border raids into Israel, often targeting Israeli civilians and military positions. These incursions invariably led to swift and often disproportionate Israeli military reprisals, further escalating regional tensions. This precarious balance was shattered in June 1967. The Six-Day War erupted amidst escalating tensions. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's decision to close the Straits of Turin, blocking Israeli access to the Red Sea, and his demand for the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula, combined with an active buildup of Arab armies on Israel's borders, convinced Israel's leadership that an attack was imminent. In a preemptive strike, Israel launched a devastating air assault on June 5, 1967, crippling the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. What followed was a decisive and rapid victory for Israel. Within 6 days, the Israeli military soundly defeated the combined Arab armies. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This swift military triumph redrew the map of the Middle East, fundamentally altering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The 1967 war marked the beginning of Israel's direct military occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. Suddenly, over 1 million Palestinians in these territories came under Israeli rule. The international community responded swiftly. The UN Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 242 in November 1967, which called for withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, in exchange for termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. This resolution laid the foundation for the Land for Peace principle that would guide future peace efforts. Life under occupation for Palestinians in the newly acquired territories was characterized by a direct military administration. Israeli military orders dictated almost every aspect of daily life, from urban planning and resource allocation to movement and political activity. While initially many Palestinians hoped for a quick international resolution or return to Arab rule, the reality of prolonged Israeli control quickly set in. One of the most consequential developments of the occupation, particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, was the initiation and expansion of Israeli settlements. These were Jewish communities built on land captured in 1967. The motivations behind their establishment were varied. Some were driven by security concerns, creating buffer zones, others by religious and historical ties to the land, and still others by Zionist ideology aiming to solidify Israel's presence. From an international legal perspective, many, including the UN and most international law bodies, consider these settlements illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring its own population into occupied territory. Regardless of their legality, their continuous expansion has physically altered the landscape, fragmenting Palestinian areas and making the vision of a contiguous, viable Palestinian state increasingly difficult to realize. For Palestinians, the occupation meant significant infringements on their everyday freedoms. This included a complex permit system for movement between towns and cities, arbitrary checkpoints, land confiscations for roads and settlements, and control over crucial resources, particularly water. The Israeli economy, on the other hand, benefited from cheap Palestinian labor and access to a captive market for its products. Palestinian resistance under occupation varied, encompassing both armed struggle and nonviolent forms. The PLO, operating from outside the occupied territories, continued its efforts to liberate Palestine through revolutionary means. However, within the occupied territories, a more localized resistance emerged, including protests, strikes, and expressions of cultural defiance, attempting to maintain Palestinian identity and presence in the face of foreign rule. These persistent acts of resistance, often met with forceful Israeli responses, would simmer for decades, ultimately erupting into a popular uprising. While the primary focus of settlement expansion and economic integration occurred in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip's experience of occupation, though sharing many similarities, began to chart a distinct and ultimately more isolated course. Gaza, already a densely populated strip filled with refugees from the 1948 war, faced unique challenges under direct Israeli military rule. Its very geography, small size, and overwhelming refugee population would set it on a path emphasizing its unique character and the escalating challenges to come. Chapter 4. Gaza's Unique Path. From Egyptian rule to Israeli occupation and beyond. The Gaza Strip, a sliver of land approximately 25 miles long and 4 to 7.5 miles wide, has always stood apart within the broader Palestinian narrative. Its geographical isolation, its border with Egypt to the south and Israel to the north and east, with the Mediterranean Sea to the west, has historically shaped its inhabitants' destiny. After the 1948 war, the Strip found itself under Egyptian military administration, a period that laid the groundwork for its distinct and often arduous future. Under Egyptian rule from 1949 to 1967, Gaza's most defining characteristic became its overwhelming refugee population. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, expelled or fleeing from what became southern Israel, poured into its already densely populated urban centers and newly established UNRWA refugee camps, a territory that was home to around 80,000 people before 1948 suddenly housed over 200,000, creating unprecedented population density and a humanitarian crisis. Egyptian Administrator Major General Mohammed Naguib famously described Gaza as 500,000 people in half a square mile. The Egyptian administration saw Gaza as a temporary holding area. There was minimal investment in its economic development, leaving its burgeoning population largely dependent on UNRWA aid and the limited opportunities provided by Egypt. This environment of stagnation and displacement also became a launching pad for armed resistance. From the mid-1950s, Palestinian Fedayeen groups, sometimes supported by Egyptian intelligence, initiated cross-border raids into Israel from Gaza. These incursions invariably elicited swift and often harsh Israeli military retaliations, establishing a tragic cycle of violence that would become a chronic feature of the Strip's existence. The 1956 Suez Crisis also saw a brief Israeli occupation of Gaza, during which Israel attempted to suppress Fedayeen activity, only to withdraw under international pressure. This temporary occupation foreshadowed future, more prolonged military engagements. The 1967 Six-Day War brought Gaza, along with the West Bank and Golan Heights, under Israeli military occupation. For Gazans, this meant transitioning from Egyptian military rule to Israeli military rule. While the occupation of Gaza shared many characteristics with that of the West Bank, such as military orders governing daily life and restrictions on movement, Gaza's unique demographic and economic realities led to a different trajectory. Its extreme population density, with a majority consisting of 1948 refugees and their descendants, contributed to a deeply entrenched sense of grievance and resistance. Initially, during the first 2 decades of Israeli occupation, there was a degree of economic integration. Gazans, particularly from the refugee camps, found employment as cheap labor in Israel's agricultural and construction sectors. Gaza's agricultural products also found a market within Israel. However, this dependence created an unequal economic relationship. Gaza's own economy remained underdeveloped, unable to generate sufficient jobs for its rapidly growing population. This reliance made the Strip vulnerable to Israeli closures and restrictions, which would become increasingly frequent over time. It was in this environment of occupation, refugee camps, and economic hardship that the seeds of another significant resistance movement were sown. While the secular PLO factions initially dominated Palestinian nationalism, a new force, rooted in religious identity, was quietly gaining strength. Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement. Emerging from the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hamas initially focused on social services, known as Dawah, Islamic outreach. It established a network of schools, clinics, and charities, providing vital support to a population often neglected by the PLO and struggling under occupation. Ironically, Israel, in a classic divide-and-rule strategy, initially tolerated or even quietly encouraged the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza as a perceived counterweight to the secular and nationalist PLO. However, Hamas's religious ideology was intertwined with a deep commitment to armed resistance against the occupation and the liberation of all of historical Palestine. The simmering frustrations in Gaza and the West Bank finally boiled over in December 1987 with the outbreak of the First Intifada, meaning shaking off in Arabic. This largely spontaneous, grassroots Palestinian uprising was sparked by a traffic accident in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, where an Israeli military vehicle collided with a civilian car, killing 4 Palestinians. The incident ignited widespread protests, which quickly spread throughout Gaza and then to the West Bank. Unlike previous armed struggles dominated by external PLO factions, the First Intifada was truly a popular uprising. It was characterized by mass civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts of Israeli goods, and the iconic image of Palestinian youth throwing stones at heavily armed Israeli soldiers. It was a protest against the cumulative impact of 20 years of occupation, the daily humiliations, the land confiscations, the limited opportunities, and the absence of a political horizon. Gaza, with its high concentration of refugees, poverty, and youth, immediately became a central flashpoint and one of the most active centers of the Intifada. Israel's initial response was a harsh iron fist policy, epitomized by then-Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin's directive to break their bones. Thousands of Palestinians were arrested and imprisoned, many without trial. Yet the Intifada proved resilient. It highlighted to the world the reality of the occupation, mobilized international public opinion, and deeply impacted Israeli society. The high human cost and continuous unrest led to a growing recognition within Israeli political circles that the status quo was unsustainable. The First Intifada thus served as a painful but potent catalyst. It forced Israel to acknowledge the need for political solutions rather than solely military ones. Critically, it also pushed the PLO, then based in Tunisia, to recognize the necessity of engaging in political negotiations, acknowledging that resistance from within would need to be supported by diplomatic efforts. This shift, coupled with global geopolitical changes following the end of the Cold War, would ultimately pave the way for secret negotiations between Israel and the PLO. Negotiations that promised an entirely new chapter in the long and tragic history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Gaza, the cradle of so much resistance, would again find itself at the center of these shifting tides. Chapter 5, The Road to Oslo, Hopes and Disappointments for Peace. The First Intifada, though a violent and costly struggle, inadvertently set the stage for one of the most hopeful, yet ultimately disappointed, chapters in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the peace process of the 1990s, culminating in the Oslo Accords. A confluence of international events created a unique window of opportunity that both sides, albeit hesitantly, seized upon. The end of the Cold War fundamentally reshaped global geopolitics. The Soviet Union's collapse removed a major patron for some radical Arab states and Palestinian factions, reducing their ability to obstruct peace overtures. Then, in 1991, the Gulf War further altered the regional landscape. The PLO's support for Saddam Hussein during Iraq's invasion of Kuwait alienated many Arab states, marginalizing Yasser Arafat and driving the PLO into a desperate financial and political corner. This provided an incentive for reconciliation and a strategic realignment. The United States, emerging as the sole superpower, became an increasingly active and influential mediator. These shifts paved the way for the Madrid Conference in October 1991. Co-sponsored by the U.S. and the Soviet Union, it brought together Israel, Arab states, and a Palestinian delegation, not directly from the PLO, but comprised of prominent figures from the occupied territories. While it produced no immediate breakthroughs, it was a symbolic landmark. The first time Arab leaders and Israelis sat face-to-face at a public negotiating table, marking a cautious shift towards direct dialogue. However, the real breakthrough occurred behind closed doors, in a place far removed from the public glare, a secret channel in Norway. Starting in 1992, Israeli and PLO representatives began clandestine negotiations, bypassing the official Madrid talks and the long-held Israeli taboo against direct talks with the PLO. This secret dialogue reflected a pragmatic realization on both sides. For Israel, the First Intifada had demonstrated the high cost of occupation. For the PLO, the post-Gulf War reality showed the limits of armed struggle and the need for diplomatic engagement. This covert diplomacy culminated in the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements, DOP, signed on the White House lawn on September 13, 1993. This historic event, most famously symbolized by the handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, brokered by U.S. President Bill Clinton, became known as the Oslo Accords. The core of the Oslo Accords was a framework for phased Israeli withdrawal and the creation of an interim Palestinian self-governing body, the Palestinian Authority, PA. The Accords established mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. Israel formally recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and renounced terrorism. The agreement envisioned a 5-year interim period during which further negotiations would address the most contentious, permanent status issues: Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, final borders, and security arrangements, with the ultimate goal of a comprehensive peace agreement. This deferment of the most difficult issues was crucial, but also a significant flaw. Initial steps were swift. In May 1994, the Gaza-Jericho First Agreement extended PA self-rule to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank city of Jericho. Yasser Arafat returned to Gaza, and later Jericho, for the first time in decades to head the new Palestinian Authority, marking a momentous occasion for Palestinians. Subsequent interim agreements, such as Oslo II, 1995, elaborated on the transfer of power and delineated 3 areas of control in the West Bank. Area A, full PA civil and security control. Area B, PA civil control, Israeli security control, and Area C, full Israeli civil and security control, including settlements. Gaza was mostly designated Area A. The signing of the accords brought immense hope and earned Rabin, Arafat, and Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres the Nobel Peace Prize. However, underlying the optimism were deep challenges that would ultimately unravel the process. From the Palestinian perspective, disillusionment began to grow rapidly. The phased Israeli withdrawals were slow and uneven, and Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank continued unabated, eating away at the very land envisioned for a future Palestinian state. Palestinian life remained constrained by checkpoints and economic restrictions, leading many to feel that the interim arrangements were becoming permanent. Furthermore, concerns over corruption and authoritarian tendencies within the newly formed Palestinian Authority governance began to erode public trust. On both sides, powerful forces opposed the peace process. For Palestinians, militant groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, rejecting the accords as a sellout of Palestinian rights, intensified their campaign of suicide bombings and other attacks against Israeli civilians. These acts were devastating, sowing terror and undermining Israeli public confidence in the peace process. Each bombing reinforced the narrative among Israeli hardliners that the PLO could not control its own radicals and that trading land for peace was a dangerous illusion. Within Israel, the right-wing opposition viewed the Oslo Accords as a catastrophic compromise of national security and a betrayal of religious and historical claims to the entire land. Their protests were vocal and increasingly inflammatory. The ultimate tragic blow to the peace efforts came on November 4, 1995, when Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist who vehemently opposed the peace process. Rabin's death robbed Israel of a leader who had made the difficult transition from military general to peacemaker, and it severely destabilized the political landscape. Despite these setbacks, efforts continued. The culmination of the Oslo era was the Camp David Summit in July 2000, hosted by President Clinton and involving Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat. These were intensive, high-stakes negotiations aimed at reaching a final status agreement on all core issues. However, the talks ultimately collapsed, principally over the intractable issues of Jerusalem and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Each side blamed the other for the failure. Israelis claimed Arafat rejected a generous offer. Palestinians stated the offer did not fully address their fundamental rights and sovereignty. The failure of Camp David marked the effective end of the Oslo peace process. It shattered hopes for a negotiated two-state solution and led to a profound sense of despair and betrayal among Palestinians. This disappointment, coupled with the cumulative frustrations of occupation and the ongoing violence, would soon ignite a far more brutal and widespread conflict, plunging the region into renewed bloodshed and setting Gaza on a more isolated and desperate trajectory. Chapter 6: The Second Intifada and Disengagement, Gaza's Shift Towards Isolation. The hopeful, yet ultimately failed, peace process of the 1990s, and the collapse of the Camp David summit in 2000, paved the way for a new, far more violent chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. This period fundamentally reshaped the conflict, leading to Israel's unilateral disengagement from Gaza and setting the Strip on a path of increasing isolation and prolonged crisis. The factors igniting the Second Intifada were manifold. Deep Palestinian frustration over the lack of progress in the peace process, the continuation of Israeli settlement expansion, and the feeling that negotiations had become a mirage under occupation formed a volatile backdrop. The immediate spark is widely considered to be Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem on September 28, 2000. For Palestinians, this visit by a hawkish Israeli opposition leader to one of Islam's holiest sites, considered part of occupied East Jerusalem, was seen as a deliberate provocation and a symbolic assertion of Israeli sovereignty over a holy place. Protests quickly erupted, spiraling into widespread violence. Unlike the First Intifada, which was largely a civil and popular uprising, the Second Intifada was characterized by a far greater level of armed confrontation. Palestinian militant groups, including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and elements of Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades, escalated their tactics to include pervasive suicide bombings and armed attacks against Israeli civilians in buses, cafes, and city centers, as well as against military targets. The violence was indiscriminate and devastating, causing widespread terror and loss of life within Israel. Israel's response was a full-scale military offensive. Under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, Israel launched large-scale military operations, including Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, reoccupying Palestinian cities in the West Bank that had been under Palestinian Authority control since Oslo. The Israeli military conducted targeted assassinations of militant leaders, imposed widespread closures and curfews, and, controversially, began constructing the separation barrier, a complex system of walls, fences, and checkpoints, primarily in the West Bank. Israel asserted the barrier was essential for security, effectively halting suicide bombings. Palestinians condemned it as an apartheid wall that severed communities, confiscated land, and further stifled their movement. The human cost of the Second Intifada was staggering. Thousands of lives lost, overwhelmingly Palestinian, and both economies were severely impacted, deepening the societal trauma on both sides. The Gaza Strip, with its high population density and entrenched militant factions, quickly became a key battlefield. It served as a launching point for rockets and mortar shells fired towards Israeli towns, particularly Sderot and Ashkelon, leading to frequent Israeli aerial and ground incursions. The violence here was incessant, further weakening the Strip's already fragile infrastructure and economy. The relentless violence and the perceived intractability of the conflict prompted a radical shift in Israeli policy. In 2004, Ariel Sharon, once the architect of settlement expansion, announced his plan for a unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip. This plan entailed the dismantling of all 21 Israeli settlements in Gaza, along with 4 small settlements in the northern West Bank, and the complete withdrawal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip. Sharon's motivations were complex. Demographic concerns played a significant role. Israel did not want to perpetually rule over a large, growing Palestinian population in Gaza, fearing its eventual impact on Israel's Jewish majority. Security arguments also underpin the decision. Removing settlers and soldiers from direct daily friction would, it was argued, reduce flashpoints for violence and allow the military greater freedom to act against threats emanating from Gaza. There was also a sense of international pressure to ease the burden of occupation. Fundamentally, it was a move towards unilateral separation rather than a negotiated peace. The implementation of the disengagement in August 2005 was highly contentious within Israel. It involved the emotional and often forceful evacuation of thousands of settlers and their homes, sparking widespread protests among religious Zionists and right-wing elements who viewed it as a surrender of Israeli land. For the Gaza Strip, the disengagement brought a complicated set of consequences. Initially, there was a widespread sense of optimism among Palestinians. Many hoped it signified the end of Israeli occupation and an opportunity for genuine self-governance and economic development. The removal of settlements, which had occupied significant and valuable land, seemed to open up new possibilities. However, this optimism quickly faded. While Israel withdrew its ground forces and settlers, it maintained absolute control over Gaza's borders, land, sea, and air. It controlled all entry and exit points for goods and people, effectively turning the Strip into an isolated enclave. This control allowed Israel to impose severe restrictions on economic activity, development, and the overall movement of goods and people. This laid the foundation for what would quickly become a comprehensive blockade. Without external access and vital resources for reconstruction or trade, Gaza's economy rapidly deteriorated, trapping its population in poverty. Furthermore, the Israeli withdrawal created a significant power vacuum within Gaza. The unified Palestinian leadership that had emerged during the Intifadas was fractured. The perennial rivalry between the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority and the increasingly powerful Hamas intensified. With the removal of Israel's direct military presence, these internal divisions simmered and eventually boiled over. This internal strife, coupled with the ongoing rocket fire from Gaza by various militant groups, often provoking immediate Israeli retaliations, set the stage for the dramatic events that would follow, definitively sealing Gaza's fate as a uniquely isolated and besieged territory caught in an escalating cycle of violence and despair. Chapter 7, Hamas Ascends, the struggle for Gaza's control. The Israeli disengagement from Gaza in 2005 created not an oasis of peace, but a dangerous power vacuum. With Israel's physical presence removed, the internal political dynamics within the Palestinian territories, particularly the long-standing rivalry between the secular Fatah movement and the Islamist Hamas, came to a head. This struggle for control would dramatically reshape Gaza's destiny, leading to its effective political isolation and the comprehensive blockade that defines its existence today. Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, had steadily risen in prominence since its founding in the late 1980s. While recognized internationally primarily for its armed wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, and its commitment to resistance against Israel, its strength within Palestinian society lay also in its extensive dawah, social welfare, network. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, while the Palestinian Authority, PA, was perceived by many Palestinians as corrupt and ineffective, and the Oslo peace process failed to deliver tangible improvements, Hamas's provision of schools, clinics, and food aid built a powerful popular base. Its uncompromising stance against Israeli occupation and its rejection of the Oslo Accords resonated with a population increasingly disillusioned by failed peace attempts and continued hardship. This growing influence culminated in the Palestinian legislative elections of January 2006. These were the second general elections since the PA's establishment, and they shocked many, both locally and internationally. Hamas mounted a well-organized grassroots campaign, running on an anti-corruption platform and promising fundamental changes. To the surprise of many, and despite widespread international calls for a Fatah victory, Hamas secured a decisive majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. This electoral victory was a direct reflection of Palestinian frustration with Fatah's perceived inefficiencies and corrupt practices, and a demand for a stronger, more principled approach to resistance against the Israeli occupation. The international reaction to Hamas's electoral victory was swift and largely negative. Many Western nations, including the United States and the European Union, refused to recognize the Hamas-led government, primarily because they designated Hamas as a terrorist organization that refused to recognize Israel, renounce violence, or accept past agreements between Israel and the PLO. This refusal led to significant cuts in international aid to the Palestinian Authority, effectively imposing a financial strangulation on the newly elected Hamas government. This international isolation exacerbated the already fragile economic situation in the Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza. The political situation within the Palestinian territories rapidly deteriorated into outright conflict. The cohabitation of a Hamas-led government with a Fatah-controlled Palestinian Authority presidency, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, proved untenable. Attempts to form a national unity government repeatedly failed. Tensions between the Hamas-controlled executive force and the Fatah-aligned security forces escalated into violent clashes across the Gaza Strip. Each side accused the other of undermining its authority, seizing weapons, and plotting coups. The climax arrived in June 2007, during what became known as the Battle of Gaza. Following weeks of intense skirmishes, Hamas launched a decisive military offensive against Fatah forces in Gaza. After brutal street fighting, Hamas swiftly routed Fatah loyalists, seizing control of all government and security institutions in the Strip. Many Fatah leaders and security members fled to Egypt or the West Bank. This bloody takeover solidified Hamas's complete control over the Gaza Strip, transforming it into a de facto state-like entity. The immediate consequence of Hamas's takeover of Gaza was the definitive political and geographical split of the Palestinian territories. From that point forward, two separate administrations governed: Hamas in full control of the Gaza Strip and the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority continuing to govern parts of the West Bank. This division fundamentally complicated any unified Palestinian approach to negotiations with Israel and created insurmountable obstacles for international peacemaking efforts. In response to Hamas's takeover, the international community, led by Israel and supported by Egypt, immediately imposed a comprehensive blockade on the Gaza Strip. The stated purpose of the blockade was threefold: to pressure Hamas to end rocket fire into Israel, to prevent the import of weapons and dual-use goods that could be used for military purposes, e.g., certain building materials, and to isolate Hamas politically and economically. Israel argued it was a necessary security measure to protect its citizens from militant attacks. Egypt, wary of Hamas's ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, also largely restricted movement through its Rafah crossing with Gaza. The impact of this blockade was immediate and devastating for Gaza's civilian population. With severe restrictions on the movement of people and goods, Gaza's already fragile economy collapsed. Exports dwindled, unemployment skyrocketed, and critical infrastructure deteriorated due to the inability to import necessary materials for repair and development. The Strip, overcrowded and now internationally shunned, rapidly transformed into what many critics termed an open-air prison. Under these conditions, Hamas began the challenging task of governing the Strip. It established its own security apparatus, law enforcement, and administrative structures, often in parallel to the remnants of the PA's bureaucracy. While facing immense external pressure and international isolation, Hamas maintained its tight grip on power, continuing its dual strategy of violent resistance against Israel and providing social services to its beleaguered population, setting the stage for subsequent cycles of devastating conflict. Chapter 8: Life Under Siege, Humanitarian Crisis and Daily Realities in Gaza. Following Hamas's takeover in 2007, the Gaza Strip effectively became an isolated entity, subjected to a comprehensive blockade imposed by Israel, with varying degrees of cooperation from Egypt. This blockade, justified by Israel as a necessary security measure against Hamas and against rocket fire, turned Gaza into a laboratory for perpetual crisis, profoundly impacting every facet of daily life for its nearly 2.3 million inhabitants. To understand Gaza today is to understand the lived reality of siege. The economic and humanitarian indicators paint a dire picture. Poverty rates are startlingly high, consistently hovering around 60%, with food insecurity affecting an even larger percentage of the population. Unemployment, particularly among youth, regularly exceeds 50%, one of the highest rates globally. With few opportunities for meaningful work, dependence on humanitarian aid has become a way of life for the majority of Gazans, eroding self-sufficiency and dignity. The consequences of the blockade cascade across all essential services. Gaza's healthcare system is perennially on the brink of collapse. Hospitals often face chronic shortages of essential medicines, medical equipment, and even basic supplies like bandages. Power outages, a daily occurrence, jeopardize the functioning of critical medical machinery, from operating theaters to incubators, forcing reliance on expensive, often unreliable generators. Furthermore, access to specialized medical treatment outside Gaza, often available only in Israel or the West Bank, is severely restricted, requiring complex and lengthy permit processes which are frequently denied, sometimes fatally. Water and sanitation present an existential crisis. Over 95% of Gaza's aquifer is unfit for human consumption due to over-extraction, sewage contamination, and saline intrusion from the Mediterranean Sea. Many residents rely on expensive, privately purchased filtered water or communal wells, which are often contaminated. Inadequate sewage treatment facilities mean that large quantities of raw or poorly treated wastewater are discharged directly into the Mediterranean, polluting the coastline and jeopardizing public health and the meager fishing industry. Diseases linked to contaminated water are a constant threat, particularly to children. Electricity shortages are endemic. Gazans typically receive only a few hours of electricity per day, if that, with the schedule often unpredictable. Homes, schools, and businesses are reliant on costly private generators, which are loud, polluting, and a fire hazard. The lack of consistent power cripples industry, disrupts education, and makes daily life a continuous struggle. Food cannot be reliably refrigerated, studies are conducted by candlelight, and even communication can be difficult. Even when conflicts abate, infrastructure decay persists. Reconstruction after recurrent bombardments is severely hampered by restrictions on the import of raw materials like cement, steel, and glass, which Israel classifies as dual-use items that could potentially be diverted for military purposes. This means homes, schools, and hospitals are rebuilt slowly, if at all, leaving a landscape scarred by past destruction and a population living in precarious conditions. Beyond the numbers, the blockade's deepest impact lies on the human spirit. Generations of Gazans have grown up knowing nothing but siege, multiple wars, and a suffocating lack of freedom. This perpetual trauma has led to alarmingly high rates of psychological distress, particularly among children. Studies have consistently shown widespread symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Children who have endured multiple conflicts and constant deprivation often exhibit behavioral problems, sleep disturbances, and a pervasive sense of fear and hopelessness. The restrictions on movement severely limit opportunities for personal and professional growth. Students cannot pursue higher education abroad, academics are cut off from international colleagues, and entrepreneurs cannot access markets or invest. What results is a sense of being trapped, locked away from the rest of the world. While the conditions are undeniably harsh, it's imperative to acknowledge the immense resilience and resourcefulness of Gazans. Despite overwhelming odds, they find ways to cope, to learn, to innovate, and to live. Communities demonstrate remarkable self-help. Yet, the persistent stripping away of opportunity and normal liberties represents a profound loss of dignity and hope for many, feeding a cycle of desperation. The mechanics of the blockade are multi-layered. Israel controls all land crossings into Gaza, primarily through the Kerem Shalom crossing for commercial goods and Erez crossing for the limited movement of people, primarily humanitarian cases, some merchants, and international staff. Movement for ordinary citizens, including students, workers, and families, is severely restricted. The Rafah crossing with Egypt, Gaza's only non-Israeli land exit, opens irregularly and often with stringent Egyptian controls, reflecting Cairo's own security concerns and complex relationship with both Israel and Hamas. Gaza's maritime zone is severely restricted by the Israeli Navy, limiting fishing to a small, often shifting, and dangerous area close to shore, thereby devastating a traditional livelihood. Additionally, Gaza's airspace is fully controlled by Israel, with no functioning airport, further solidifying its isolation. For years, a network of underground tunnels connecting Gaza to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula served as Gaza's lifeline, albeit an illicit one. These tunnels facilitated the entry of everything from consumer goods and fuel to weapons, circumventing official crossings. However, under pressure from Israel and facing its own security threats in Sinai, Egypt launched a campaign to destroy most of these tunnels and created a buffer zone along its border, further tightening the noose on Gaza. Central to sustaining life in Gaza, particularly for the refugee population, is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. Established after the 1948 war, UNRWA provides essential services including education for over 280,000 children, healthcare through dozens of clinics, and critical food aid to over 1 million people in Gaza alone. Its role is indispensable, filling vast gaps left by the collapsed economy and the limitations of local governance. However, UNRWA frequently faces chronic funding crises, often politicized, which threaten its ability to maintain these vital services for a population that has nowhere else to turn. Through the eyes of a teacher struggling to conduct classes during prolonged blackouts, or a doctor trying to save a life without the necessary equipment, or a fisherman whose livelihood has been stripped away, the reality of life under siege is stark. It is a reality of constant adaptation, resourcefulness, and deep suffering, demonstrating the profound human cost of an ongoing political deadlock and the weaponization of economic isolation. Chapter 9. Cycles of Conflict. Major confrontations since 2008. The forced separation of Gaza from the world, combined with the entrenched political divide within the Palestinian territories and the ongoing Israeli-Hamas enmity, inevitably led to an escalating series of military confrontations. Since the Israeli disengagement in 2005 and Hamas's full takeover in 2007, Gaza has been caught in a relentless cycle of violence, each major confrontation more devastating than the last, further deepening the humanitarian crisis and entrenching the despair of its inhabitants. The pattern of escalation typically begins with localized tensions, often rocket fire from Gaza by Hamas or other militant factions targeting Israeli towns and villages, or Israeli military incursions or targeted operations within Gaza. These acts trigger a spiral of retaliation, eventually leading to full-scale military operations. The first major confrontation after Hamas assumed full control was Operation Cast Lead, launched by Israel in December 2008 and lasting into January 2009. The immediate causes were a breakdown of a 6-month ceasefire and an increase in rocket fire from Gaza into southern Israel. Israel responded with an intensive 3-week aerial bombardment campaign, followed by a ground invasion of the Strip. The stated goals were to halt rocket fire and degrade Hamas's military capabilities. The conflict resulted in widespread destruction across Gaza, including civilian infrastructure and a devastating human toll, with over 1,300 Palestinians killed, many of them civilians, and 13 Israelis killed, 10 soldiers and 3 civilians. The scale of destruction and civilian casualties led to significant international outcry and accusations of war crimes from human rights organizations. And, notably, the UN Goldstone Report, though aspects of its findings were later disputed. 4 years later, in November 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense unfolded. This 8-day conflict was triggered by an Israeli airstrike that killed Ahmed Jabari, the head of Hamas's military wing, which Israel stated was in response to ongoing rocket attacks. Hamas and other factions retaliated with heavy rocket barrages, some reaching Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for the first time. Israel responded primarily with an air campaign, targeting rocket launchers, militant infrastructure, and command centers. While shorter and less destructive than cast lead, it still resulted in over 170 Palestinian deaths and 6 Israeli deaths. An Egyptian-brokered ceasefire brought an end to the fighting, highlighting Egypt's crucial role as a mediator. This conflict also showcased the effectiveness of Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system in intercepting incoming rockets, which significantly reduced Israeli casualties compared to previous rounds. The most prolonged and destructive operation to date was Operation Protective Edge in July-August 2014. The catalyst for this 50-day war was the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank by Hamas-affiliated cells, though Hamas leadership denied direct responsibility, followed by a broad Israeli crackdown in the West Bank and a sharp increase in rocket fire from Gaza. A major Israeli concern during this conflict was Hamas's sophisticated network of cross-border attack tunnels, which militants used to infiltrate Israeli territory. The operation involved widespread Israeli airstrikes and a significant ground invasion aimed at destroying these tunnels and missile launch sites. The human cost was immense. Over 2,200 Palestinians were killed, the majority civilians, and thousands gravely wounded. Gaza's already strained infrastructure suffered catastrophic damage, with widespread destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and power plants. On the Israeli side, 67 soldiers and 6 civilians were killed. The scale of civilian suffering and destruction in Gaza led to renewed accusations of disproportionate force and war crimes, intensifying international scrutiny and widening the humanitarian catastrophe in the Strip. These major operations are interspersed with numerous smaller escalations and recurring clashes. For instance, in 2018, the Great March of Return saw weekly Palestinian protests along the Gaza border, often accompanied by attempts to breach the fence, the launching of incendiary kites and balloons into Israel, and frequent violent confrontations with Israeli forces, resulting in hundreds of Palestinian deaths and thousands injured. Each instance of rocket fire from Gaza or Israeli security operation, such as targeted assassinations or responses to border incursions, can quickly trigger a broader escalation. The cycle continued with significant clashes in May 2021, sparked by tensions in Jerusalem and the West Bank, which led to rocket barrages from Gaza and sustained Israeli airstrikes. Most recently, the large-scale and unprecedented Operation Al-Aqsa Flood initiated by Hamas on October 7, 2023, involving a devastating cross-border incursion and widespread attacks on Israeli communities, has led to Israel's most extensive military response in Gaza to date. This latest conflagration, marked by an immense loss of life on both sides and an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Gaza, underscores the deeply entrenched nature of this conflict and the catastrophic human consequences of its ongoing cycles. Each cycle of conflict leaves Gaza more devastated, its infrastructure further crippled, and its population more traumatized and desperate. The repeated rounds of violence entrench animosity, deepen radicalization, and erode any remaining hope for a peaceful resolution. For both Israelis living under the constant threat of rockets and Gazans enduring perpetual siege and bombardment, these cycles are a brutal testament to the futility of repeated violence, reinforcing a pervasive sense of insecurity and hopelessness in a small land that has seen far too much suffering. Chapter 10: International Actors and Regional Dynamics, the World's Role. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is profoundly shaped by the intricate web of regional and international actors, each with their own interests, alliances, and historical baggage. It is far from a localized dispute. Global superpowers, regional powers, and international organizations tirelessly exert influence, provide aid, and attempt to mediate, often with mixed results that both perpetuate and attempt to resolve the conflict. The United States has long been the preeminent external actor, primarily serving as Israel's staunchest ally and its most significant diplomatic and financial supporter. Billions of dollars in military aid annually underpin Israel's security, while consistent diplomatic backing, particularly at the UN Security Council, where the U.S. often exercises its veto power to block resolutions critical of Israel, provides crucial political leverage. Successive U.S. administrations have also positioned themselves as the primary mediator in peace talks, culminating in moments like Camp David and Oslo. However, the perceived pro-Israel bias of American policy has often undermined its credibility as an impartial broker in the eyes of Palestinians and many Arab states. While the U.S. provides substantial humanitarian and development aid to Palestinians, particularly through USAID, this aid has increasingly been conditioned or cut, further complicating its role. The European Union largely adopts a more critical stance towards Israeli settlement policy and is a significant provider of financial aid and development assistance to the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA. While generally supporting a two-state solution based on 1967 borders, its influence is often fragmented by differing member state perspectives. The EU frequently advocates for adherence to international law and human rights, distinguishing its approach from the transactional diplomacy sometimes exhibited by other powers. The United Nations plays a multifaceted, often contentious, role. Its resolutions, e.g., UNSC 242, 338, and numerous others condemning Israeli settlements or calling for a Palestinian state, form a significant body of international law and diplomatic consensus, yet their implementation remains largely elusive. Critically, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East (UNRWA) remains an indispensable lifeline. For over 70 years, UNRWA has provided essential services, education, healthcare, and food aid to millions of Palestine refugees, particularly in Gaza, where it serves as the largest humanitarian provider. Despite its vital role, UNRWA frequently faces chronic funding shortfalls and is often embroiled in political controversies, with some critics suggesting its mandate perpetuates the refugee issue. Other UN bodies, from the Human Rights Council to OCHA, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, regularly document conditions in the occupied territories, adding to the wealth of information available but often failing to trigger substantive change. Regionally, Egypt plays a crucial, though complex, role. Sharing a border with Gaza and having been its administrator prior to 1967, Egypt has historically served as a critical mediator between Israel and Palestinian factions, particularly Hamas. Its control over the Rafah border crossing, Gaza's only non-Israeli exit, gives it significant leverage, which it exerts based on its own security concerns, especially regarding Islamist militants in Sinai and its relationship with Hamas. Egypt's peace treaty with Israel means it functions as a strategic, if sometimes uneasy, partner in managing the Gaza situation. Other regional powers also exert influence. Qatar has emerged as a major financial donor to Gaza, often providing funds for civil servant salaries and humanitarian projects, thus directly influencing the Strip's internal stability. Turkey, particularly under President Erdogan, has often adopted a vocal pro-Palestinian stance, frequently condemning Israeli actions and positioning itself as a champion of Islamic causes, sometimes leading to diplomatic spats with Israel. Iran is perhaps the most significant external non-state actor. Viewing the conflict through the lens of its regional rivalry with the U.S. and Israel, Iran provides financial and military support, including weapons and training, to various Palestinian militant groups, most notably Islamic Jihad, and to a lesser extent, Hamas. This backing empowers these groups, but also contributes to the cycle of violence and makes any resolution more elusive. For decades, the Arab world maintained a relatively unified stance, articulated in the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which offered full diplomatic relations with Israel in exchange for withdrawal from occupied territories, a just solution for Palestinian refugees, and the establishment of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. However, recent years have seen a significant realignment with the signing of the Abraham Accords in 2020. These groundbreaking agreements saw the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco normalize diplomatic relations with Israel, largely bypassing the traditional land for peace paradigm rooted in the Palestinian issue. These accords reflect a shifting strategic landscape, driven by shared security concerns, particularly regarding Iran, economic interests, and a growing weariness with the Palestinian issue among some Arab states. While framed as a step toward broader regional stability, they were viewed by many Palestinians as a betrayal, eroding their leverage and further sidelining their cause on the international stage. Ultimately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a global barometer. It reflects broader geopolitical shifts, regional power struggles, and the enduring challenge of reconciling competing historical claims and national aspirations. While international actors frequently call for peace, their divergent interests, priorities, and actions often contribute to the impasse, leaving the inhabitants of Gaza and the region locked in a complex struggle whose resolution seems perpetually deferred. Chapter 11, Seeking a Path Forward, Current Challenges and Future Possibilities. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, often described as one of the world's most intractable disputes, remains stubbornly resistant to resolution. Decades of peace efforts, marked by fleeting hopes and crushing disappointments, have left a landscape of entrenched positions, deep-seated mistrust, and a seemingly perpetual cycle of violence. Understanding the paths forward necessitates an honest assessment of both the formidable obstacles and the elusive possibilities. For many years, the internationally accepted framework for peace has been the two-state solution. This paradigm envisions the creation of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, fulfilling the national aspirations of both peoples. Proponents argue it offers the most pragmatic path to ensuring Israel's security as a democratic Jewish state and granting Palestinians sovereignty and dignity. However, its viability has eroded significantly over time. Continuous Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank has fragmented Palestinian territory, making the creation of a contiguous and economically viable Palestinian state incredibly challenging. Disagreements over the 1967 borders, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and security arrangements remain profound and seemingly irreconcilable. Furthermore, the persistent political division between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank prevents any unified Palestinian front necessary for credible negotiations. As a result, the two-state solution, while a long-standing international consensus, increasingly appears to be either moribund or, at best, a distant aspiration. The perceived waning of the two-state solution has led to renewed discussion of a one-state solution. This concept proposes a single state encompassing Israelis and Palestinians. However, different visions for such a state exist. Some advocate for a democratic, secular binational state where all citizens, regardless of ethnicity or religion, possess equal rights. Others envision a greater Israel that annexes the West Bank, often with varying, undemocratic proposals for Palestinian rights. Conversely, a one-state solution could also mean a single Palestinian state covering the entire territory. Each iteration of this solution faces staggering challenges. Demographic concerns dominate, with both sides fearing becoming a minority in a unified state. Reconciling competing national narratives, ensuring genuine equality and power sharing, and addressing profound security fears within a single framework appear almost insurmountable. The sheer scale of integrating two fully developed, antagonistic national identities with deep historical grievances into a single polity presents an unprecedented challenge. Given the difficulties of achieving either a two-state or one-state solution, the current reality for many is the management of the status quo. While this approach aims to contain conflict and manage the occupation rather than resolve it, it is inherently unstable and unsustainable. It perpetuates the Israeli occupation, maintains the blockade on Gaza, and condemns millions of Palestinians to lives of limited freedom and opportunity. This status quo is prone to sudden escalations, growing extremism, and deepening hopelessness, which invariably erupts in cycles of intense violence, as repeatedly seen in Gaza. The core issues that continue to be points of contention remain the same, permanent status issues that derailed efforts like the Oslo Accords. Jerusalem. Sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the city's status is perhaps the most emotionally charged issue. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim Jerusalem as their capital, making any compromise extremely difficult. Borders and territory. The 1967 Green Line serves as the internationally recognized baseline, but the proliferation of Israeli settlements and the construction of the separation barrier have created facts on the ground that make a return to these lines, or mutually agreed land swaps, incredibly complex. Refugees. The Palestinian demand for the right of return for 1948 refugees and their descendants to their original homes inside Israel is a deep-seated claim for Palestinians, but an existential demographic threat for Israel. Solutions typically involve compensation, return to a future Palestinian state, or absorption in host countries. UNRWA's continued existence highlights the unresolved nature of this issue. Security. Israel legitimately demands ironclad security guarantees, including protection from rockets, militant tunnels, and terrorism. Palestinians demand sovereignty that is not undermined by external interference and does not compromise their freedom of movement. Reconciling these competing security needs is a formidable task. Settlements. The future of Israeli settlements in the West Bank is a critical point of contention. Whether they would be dismantled, annexed, or become part of a future Palestinian state remains a core dispute. Internal dynamics within both Israeli and Palestinian societies also present significant obstacles. In Israel, the increasing political weight of the religious Zionist movement and the right wing, combined with a pervasive sense of security vulnerability, makes compromise on issues like settlements and Jerusalem politically difficult. In Palestinian society, the fundamental and enduring division between Fatah and Hamas remains a formidable barrier to any unified national project. True reconciliation and a shared political vision are essential for any credible state-building effort or effective negotiation with Israel. Despite the bleak outlook, avenues for positive change do exist. The role of civil society on both sides is crucial. Palestinian and Israeli peace activists, human rights organizations, and interfaith initiatives tirelessly work to build bridges of understanding, advocate for justice, and promote nonviolence, often against great odds and with significant personal risk. International legal bodies, truth commissions, and grassroots movements continue to push for accountability under international law, hoping that justice might eventually pave the way for peace. Economic development initiatives, carefully planned and executed, could alleviate some of the dire conditions in Gaza, fostering stability. Ultimately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not merely a political or territorial dispute. It is a profound human story of competing rights, historical grievances, deep-seated identities, and the fundamental human desire for dignity, security, and a national home. For Gaza, perhaps more than any other place, the path forward requires not just political will from leaders, but a global commitment to addressing the humanitarian catastrophe, dismantling the cycles of violence, and recognizing the inherent rights and deep-seated aspirations of all peoples in the region. Without genuine effort to achieve justice, security, and self-determination for both Israelis and Palestinians, the anatomy of this conflict will continue to be written in blood and despair, while the promise of a peaceful future remains tragically elusive. Conclusion. Moving forward beyond the cycle, we have journeyed through millennia of history, navigated complex political landscapes, and confronted the stark realities of life under siege. From ancient civilizations that shaped the land's identity to the seismic events of 1948 and 1967, and the more recent cycles of conflict that have turned Gaza into a crucible of human suffering, the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of profound significance and immense human cost. This odyssey has aimed to unravel the anatomy of this enduring struggle, not to offer simplistic solutions, but to foster comprehensive understanding. What becomes undeniably clear is that the destinies of Israelis and Palestinians are inextricably intertwined. Their narratives, though often conflicting and born from deeply painful experiences, are two sides of the same historical coin. For Israelis, the rebirth of a sovereign state in their ancient homeland after centuries of persecution is a triumphant narrative of self-determination and return. For Palestinians, the events of 1948 symbolize a profound rupture. The Nakba, or catastrophe marked by dispossession, exile, and the continuous struggle for statehood and the right to return. Both experiences are real, both are deeply felt, and both inform the present calcification of attitudes. The Gaza Strip stands as a stark testament to the conflict's most acute human suffering. Once a bustling trade hub in antiquity, it has been transformed into a densely populated, isolated enclave struggling under the crippling weight of blockade and repeated military operations. The daily realities for its inhabitants, the chronic shortages of clean water, electricity, and medical supplies, the soaring unemployment, and the pervasive psychological trauma paint a picture of a population teetering on the precipice of humanitarian catastrophe. Yet, amidst such immense adversity, the resilience, resourcefulness, and indomitable spirit of Gazans shine through, a testament to the human capacity for survival and defiance. The cycles of violence, particularly evident in Gaza since 2008, underscore the unbearable cost of the status quo. Each confrontation, whether sparked by rocket fire from Gaza or Israeli military actions, leads to further destruction, deepening the wounds on both sides and making any future reconciliation ever more difficult. This grim pattern demonstrates that security for one side cannot truly be achieved without addressing the fundamental needs and aspirations of the other. Looking forward, the path to a lasting peace remains shrouded in uncertainty. The long-sought two-state solution, while adhering to international consensus, faces increasingly intractable obstacles due to settlement expansion, political divisions, and a profound lack of trust. Alternative visions, such as a one-state solution, present their own complex challenges, rooted in deep demographic anxieties and the formidable task of reconciling two proud national identities within a single political framework. Ultimately, breaking this cycle requires a fundamental shift in approach. It demands leadership that is willing to envision a future beyond conflict and to make courageous, painful compromises. It necessitates an unwavering commitment to international law and human rights, ensuring accountability for all parties. It demands a renewed understanding that genuine security for Israelis cannot come at the expense of Palestinian dignity and self-determination, and that Palestinian aspirations for statehood must unequivocally guarantee Israel's right to exist in peace and security. For those engaging with this topic, the call is not to take sides in a simplistic good versus evil narrative. It is to cultivate empathy, to listen to the narratives of all affected, to critically analyze information, and to acknowledge the validity of suffering on all sides. The story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly in the Gaza Strip, is a testament to the enduring human capacity to build, to dream, and to resist, but also to inflict immense pain. It is a shared tragedy that can only find its resolution through a recognition of shared humanity and a commitment to justice for all. The chapters of this conflict are still being written. The hope, however faint, remains that future generations will turn a page onto a different reality. One where coexistence, not conflict, dictates the rhythms of life in this ancient and sacred land.